All right, here we go. Westward expansion, part 2. Here you have a picture of General George Armstrong Custer out on the plains with some Native American scouts that he was hiring. And this becomes a really contentious issue. The U.S. Army was sent out west to protect homesteaders and settlers and to also protect U.S. business interests out on the plains. Forts were established all over the West. And former Civil War vets continued serving in the Army out west as well. You also had African American troops that were out west in segregated units, and they became kind of known as Buffalo Soldiers. So here you have examples of some Buffalo Soldiers. There was even one unit based out of Missoula that had some of the first mountain bikes ever invented. And they rode from Fort Missoula all the way over to Fort Sheridan in Wyoming, either Fort Sheridan or Fort Cody. I can't remember off the top of my head. But they rode these fat-tired bicycles all the way across from Montana to Wyoming, which was pretty impressive. So as we know, this was Native American land, and they lived here first. Whites came into bloody conflict with Native Americans who were living out here. So as we push Native Americans out of the east, Eastern tribes were running into tribes that were already in existence out in the plains and in the Rocky Mountains. These Native American tribes tried to protect their lands, but finally the U.S. government was able to force them onto reservations. William Tecumseh Sherman, who was the general who burned the swath on Sherman's March to the Sea in the South at the end of the Civil War, was put in charge of the Western campaign against Native Americans. And this was basically an undeclared war against the indigenous populations in the United States. So here's William Tecumseh Sherman. So here you can see, it gets cut off a little bit up here, but from 1784 to 1819, these were Indian lands. And you can see the secessions gradually as we move through. Here's the time period of the Indian Removal Act, and Indians are being pushed further and further west until we get to 1972, and there's very little Native Americans living on their original lands anymore. And you can see here are the territories that they actually claim as well. So removal of Native Americans was no new idea. It goes all the way back to prior to Andrew Jackson. And they were not, we lump them all together, but they were not a unified cultural group. They didn't have unified languages or traditions. Some were hunter-gatherers, some were farmers. Northwest Indians relied on fish and game. Plains Indians relied on buffalo. And Andrew Jackson starts this reservation policy, and the railroad companies lobbied that they needed and wanted the most valuable Native American land. And the Plains tribes refused to restrict their movements and go to the reservations. They wanted to continue their nomadic traditional ways. So here you have sort of a generalization of the Native American tribes, say when white colonization occurs. By 1851, the Congress passed the Indian Appropriations Act, which organizes the Western tribes into reservations. So the U.S. had made all these treaties throughout time, and we've talked about some of these a little bit earlier when we talked about Andrew Jackson. And the Native Americans were now sort of having to fight to keep their land. For example, the Fort Laramie Treaty was a treaty that was made between the Cheyenne tribe and the Americans that said that the area of land belonged to the Cheyenne forever. However, when gold was discovered there, Americans forced them to sign a new treaty giving up that land. The U.S. government broke lots and lots of treaties with Native Americans. The Fort Laramie Treaty, in 1868, was between the U.S. government and the Sioux Nation, and it recognized the Black Hills as part of the Great Sioux Reservation, and they set it aside exclusively for the Sioux people. Later, the gold is discovered there, and in fact, Custer goes in to force those folks to move, and that ends up becoming Custer's last stand at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. As a way to control the Native Americans and to make sure trains got where they were going on time, and to get Native Americans to move to reservations and become farmers, it was decided that we should basically slaughter the buffalo herds. And literally people would shoot from the trains and they would just leave the carcasses behind. So thousands of buffalo in the late 1800s were slaughtered. This is about 40,000 hides that were in Kansas. Here's some gentlemen standing on buffalo skulls. So we had a whole bunch of wars in the late 1800s. The Sioux War of 1876 between Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. The Apache War led by Geronimo in the Southwest. The Battle of Little Bighorn, which included the Lakota and the Cheyenne. And then the Nez Perce with Chief Joseph. So you can see here where a lot of these battles took place, and in some places these were absolute massacres where the army moved in to a village that was relatively unprotected because the warriors were out hunting, and slaughtered just women and children and old people in a lot of cases. The Native American tribes did have a few victories, but usually those victories were immediately followed up by some sort of smackdown from the army. Ultimately, the Native Americans are defeated, like I said, despite some victories. This is I believe Wounded Knee. And their corpses were left out in the freezing, and it was pretty devastating to them. Then their children were removed and sent to Native American schools because of the DAWES Act, which was passed by Congress in 1887, which is also known as the General Allotment Act or the DAWES Servility Act. And it authorized the president to survey American Indian tribal land and divide it into allotments for individual Indians, meaning basically to take those reservations and carve them up into farms, even though they are, especially the Plains Indians, nomadic hunter-gatherers. You did have some Indian resistance movements. You had the ghost dance ceremony, which was used by Northern Plains tribes in the late 1800s. The ceremony itself was banned by the U.S. government and was banned by the DAWES Act. This led to the massacre at Wounded Knee. Tribes gathered to celebrate the ghost dance, and it was multiple tribes that had gathered, and the army just moved in and slaughtered everybody. This leads to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The tribes are gathered on the Bighorn River. General Custer tries to attack, but in this case, the Native Americans were ready, and they actually defeated the army and killed General Custer. The Nez Perce attempt to flee when the army tries to move them to their reservation, and they travel through Idaho into Oregon and Washington and up into Canada, where they are ultimately captured. And that is where Chief Joseph is just exhausted and tired, and he says his famous words, "I will fight no more forever." And it was the middle of winter, and hundreds of his tribe had died of starvation. So he says, "Hear me, chiefs, I am tired, my heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." So the Dawes Act divided the land and gave some of the Indians hopes that would become farmers, but often they were sold off to whites for super low prices. So again, not really with the intention of helping the Native Americans out. With the Dawes Act came a policy of assimilation, which meant you would farm, you would cut your hair, you would not speak your native language, you would convert to Christianity, and your children would be taken from you and sent to boarding school to learn all of these things. So here are some Native American teenagers in the late 1800s. Here's another Native American school where you can see all the kids were forced away from their families into boarding schools. They were taught sort of civilized skills, girls learning to sew. This is a Navajo boy by the name of Tom Torlino, and he entered the Carlisle Indian School. And after a short time, you can see his change. A lot of kids ran away, a lot of alcoholism. So some of the demise of the Native Americans, the introduction of the railroads, disease, which we've talked about before, smallpox, etc. Firewater or alcohol, the introduction of alcohol and the trade of alcohol with Native Americans really was very disturbing to their social systems. And then the extermination of the buffalo. So again, here's some images of buffalo extermination. So laws today protect Native American Indian reservations, and they are, however, some of the poorest people in America. In fact, NPR just did a piece on the Navajo Reservation, which is the largest reservation in the United States, and how most people don't actually have running water. And the question comes up, is running water a human right? And they have to pay for it, and they have to get it shipped and trucked in. So there's some interesting dilemmas on all of these reservations throughout the country today still. So here are some Native Americans today. So this is back again. In what ways does the American dream mean different things for Americans? When we look at this American progress painting again, what effect did all of these things have on these different groups of people, on homesteaders, on women, on miners, on immigrants, and on Native Americans? Things to consider. You don't need to know this. Bye.